Welcome to another broadcast of Philosophic Perspectives on the ArtistFirst Radio Network. All past shows are archived. Visit ArtistFirst.com. And now here's your host, Arthur D. Schwartz.
Why, hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Scott. Today we're going to have a very, very interesting show. There is a profound moral significance in a society's treatment of its elders. And the treatment of the elderly and the infirm say much about a society's moral compass. In the for-profit professional guardianship industry, we have today a classic example of the proverbial fox guarding the henhouse. The supposed protectors of elderly people, through an insidious complex of cronyism, are far too often acting as predators who prey on the people they are charged to protect. And the result is unimaginable and sad. As their hard-earned savings and wealth is stolen under the guise of protection, unspeakable horrors ensue. Now, the website of Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship reports on many chilling stories that seem impossible in the land of the free. Let me read this brief excerpt. Exposing this system is a challenge. Even though it is a real threat to anyone with assets of any kind, the court cases are called, quote-unquote, mental health issues, and so are hidden from the public. Until you are targeted, you will never even hear of guardianship. But when it comes calling, with a knock on the door from a total stranger saying you are wanted in court in 48 hours for a hearing on whether you can manage your own affairs, it is already too late. When I read this and when I hear it, images of the Gestapo or Stalin's thugs enter into my mind. It's terror. It's unbelievably frightening. It is hard to grasp that our elders can be subjected to this terror. It is my great honor this evening to have as my guest on Philosophic Perspectives the founder of Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship, Dr. Sam Sugar. Generally, folks, my style on these shows is to engage with my guests, giving my opinions and discussing in a very free, flowing dialogue style. But tonight, the show will be a little bit different because I want to allow Dr. Sugar, one of the leading authorities of the for-profit professional guardianship crisis, to have a platform for communicating the nature of the problem and what needs to be done to correct it. Of course, I'll ask questions or interject. It's not my nature to be quiet for too long. But I would like to give Dr. Sugar as much time as possible to describe what he and his organization does, the nature of the problem that we're discussing tonight, and where we go from here. So without any further ado, let me welcome Dr. Sam Sugar. Hello, Dr. Sugar. How are you today?
I'm just fine. Thank you for having me on.
It's such a pleasure to have you. It's such an important topic tonight.
Yeah, it is. I remember when I wrote those words that you read at the outset, and how naive I was when I wrote them, thinking that I was describing a situation that, for all I knew at that time, was local here in Miami, Florida. Boy, was I wrong. It applies, but what we've learned in the last 2 or 3 years of the organization, which is now national, what we learned is that this so-called industry, and others who are less politically correct call it a racket, this industry, or racket, is quite international. It happens in many countries, and there was recently an international symposium about what to do about guardianship in capitalistic societies. But in the United States, what began in the late 1980s with just a handful of professional guardians, and in fact, even by 2003, there were only about 24 professional guardians in the entire state of Florida. But what began as a couple of people figuring out that they could take advantage of elderly, widowed retirees on Miami Beach and claim that they were helping them, but instead kind of just steal their money. It has grown into an enormous, deep, wide, and thick, and clouted, and enormously moneyed system that you can find in practically every state. The only state that I'm aware of that has not reported to us is Utah. And I have a feeling, because I have some very close Mormon friends, that the Mormons just wouldn't put up with this crap. And I have a feeling that's why Utah is not, at least as far as I know, involved with this. But the headline states for this awful story are states like you would expect, where there are a lot of people with gray hair. Texas and Colorado, I'm afraid, are at near or the top of the list, followed closely by Florida, Nevada, New Mexico, California, New Jersey. We've had people call from Maine and Massachusetts, of course, which I think prompted this interview, and so many others. If you look on our website, you'll see a map of our outposts throughout the country, and that map is growing every day. So what is this? What is it we're talking about? We're talking about a process, a legal process. And by legal, I mean a court signs off on it. A judge puts his name at the bottom of a piece of paper, making it legal. So it is a legal appearing process by which typically dysfunctional families wind up losing all the assets that they thought they were going to steal from their siblings. That's one interesting way of putting it. Right. Typically what happens is that there's an elder person with assets. It doesn't have to be $100 million. I mean, I've seen cases that people argue over and go to court over and hire lawyers for $100,000. And typically it has something to do with one party believing that the other party is taking advantage of an elderly person or exploiting an elderly person, when typically the way it really works is that the individual, let's say it's a child of the elderly person, the one who's never around, the one who doesn't live near their parent, the one who hasn't contributed anything, gets crazed, and that's my phrase, when another sibling is with the parent most of the time, helping them, taking to the doctor, arranging their care, and doing everything that we imagine a good child, a good kid would do for their parents. And then somehow or another, the other sibling begins to believe that they're not going to get what they're entitled to. They accuse them of all kinds of horrible things, and sooner or later somebody hires a lawyer. And that lawyer goes in front of a judge, and until July 1st of this year in Florida, that lawyer, and I'll just give you a little quote from a state's attorney who I developed a relationship. I asked him, why is it that lawyers get to go in front of a judge and lie with impunity? And his answer was, because, Sam, that's what lawyers do. That's his quote. So they go in front of a judge, and this is what they say, almost, in fact, verbatim many times, but nearly verbatim all the time. Judge, we have an emergency here. There's an elderly person, and that elderly person, Judge, is at risk of being exploited. Judge, do something. They're going to steal all their money, and we here tell that this person's life is at risk because they're trying to poison her.
Right.
Well, the reason I know that scenario is because it was the one used against me, verbatim. That's exactly how it happened. I'm a board-certified specialist in internal medicine. I've been at my art and my craft for a long time, and when I retired a few years ago, I was at the top of my game with an international patient base, every recognition you could imagine, and here this lawyer goes in front of this judge and says, I am trying to kill my mother-in-law for the last several years, which tells you a couple of things. Number one, I must be the worst poisoner on the planet, because it's been years and years that I've been involved with my mother-in-law as her power of attorney, and she's still around. Number two, it tells you the depths to which these rogue attorneys, and there aren't that many of them in Florida, of the 100,000 attorneys, that's what, believe it or not, there's 100,000 lawyers in Florida. We're only talking about maybe 2%, really. Right. Because, despite the fact that many people think all lawyers are terrible, I don't. I have a son and a brother who are attorneys, and I think most lawyers are pretty good people and do a pretty good job. But there's exceptions in every profession. These particular outliers make a bloody fortune for doing nothing more than piling up what's called litigation by the pound. Right. And they put these fees in for stuff they might or might not do. Of course, nobody knows anything that goes on in guardianship because, as you mentioned, all the records are sealed because it's so-called a mental health issue, which is a real problem because item number one that pops up is that our organization and others try to do research on this issue, and it is simply impossible because there are no data. The states refuse to collect data on guardianship. So our job of trying to analyze it and make it simple for people to understand even how many wards there are in a state or the country is very difficult. I'll answer those two questions immediately. In the state of Florida, we estimate that there is somewhere between 75,000 and 110,000 wards. Across the United States, according to the GAO, which made a report on this in 2010, which is available online, there are somewhere between 1.5 and 3.0 million wards. You understand that each of these cases about an individual ward involves usually 4 to 5 family members, and not to mention extended family who have an interest in intergenerational transfer of wealth. So you're talking about large numbers of people who are affected by this racket. Well, what happens next is the judge says, well, we have to do something. This person's in danger of being exploited, and maybe they're going to die on my watch. And the next thing that happens is something that's called an emergency temporary guardianship, which is something you've never heard of before. It was something I'd never heard of before. And an emergency temporary guardianship is an action that a court takes that suspends all due process. It shoot first and ask questions, maybe ask questions later. All of the person's civil rights are instantly disappeared.
No fact-finding at that point?
With zero fact-finding, with only an allegation from one lawyer. Now, as of July 1st of this year, our legislation, which we're very, very proud of, and which frankly is a miracle because it passed the entire Florida legislature unopposed, 140 to nothing. This new law went into effect the 1st of July, and it makes doing what I just described a felony. Right. And that's great. Right. That's great. But that's just the tip of an enormous iceberg.
Has it been working?
Well, it's too early to tell. So far, the answer is no, because you can pass laws all you want, and we've proven to be pretty good at it as a grassroots organization. But here's the hard lesson we're learning today, and that is you can pass all the laws you want, but if no one enforces them, they're worthless. And to date, we are having our difficulties dealing with states' attorneys who, in order to follow that law, would have to be putting some of their fellow lawyers in jail.
Exactly.
And that's a problem. That's a real problem. So we're working on that. I'll mention some of that later in terms of our agenda for the coming year. So anyhow, here everybody stands. The judge has decided that this elderly individual who might be worth, for example, Tom Benson, who is the owner of the New Orleans Saints, a multi-billionaire. Donald Sterling, the owner of the basketball team, former, right, as well as Glenn Campbell, Mickey Rooney, Casey Kasem, Peter Falk. on our webpage, I have an article about what do I and all of these people have in common. You'll see a lot of celebrities and famous names who died in the throes of guardianship. And there's a lot of them because, like Dillinger, they go where the money is.
Right.
So, in a heartbeat, this innocent individual who's done nothing wrong, who has not been proven to need a guardian yet, is suddenly what's called an AIP, an alleged incapacitated person. And within very short order, the judge sends out examiners. Now, this is the case in Florida. It's a little different in every state, but the game plan's pretty much the same. Court sends out some court cronies, only one of whom has to be a physician, by the way.
Right.
I know of cases where a highway patrolman was used instead of physicians to determine incapacity. They are paid $400 per examination. These examinations can last as little as 10 minutes. No physical examination is ever performed, despite the law requiring it. And for the most part, these so-called examiners, if they want to keep their referrals going, seem to find a huge proportion, nearly all, of their examinees to be incapacitated.
Right. No, the system's rigged.
You said that, right. Remember, I'm not looking to take on any more challenges that I need.
No,
but
quote me on that one. Okay.
Yeah, it is a system that would appear to the average sentient being to be rigged. The three examiners send in their reports. Usually, they're asked not to confer with each other, but I'm aware of so many cases where the reports are basically Xeroxed.
Right.
And they typically say, this person is fully incapacitated, can't handle their own affairs, and Mr. Judge, you were right in sending us out, and by the way, keep sending us those good cases, Judge. Right. Before you know it, the court appoints a private, for-profit guardian. Now, we just changed some laws in Florida here, too, because we found out that these guardians troll for cases. In other words, when they get their certification, which requires nothing more than the completion of a 40-hour internet course and passing a test that most third graders wouldn't have difficulty with, these so-called newly certified guardians are instructed to go out and troll for patients. Now, where do they go? Well, they go to hospitals, they go to assisted living facilities, they go to doctors' offices, senior centers,
right.
And they troll for patients. Now, that system has its own problems, and that's why our new law prevents those first emergency guardians from becoming permanent guardians, which is a nice step, and it'll cut down the trolling a little bit.
Well, the whole idea of trolling, I mean, it's all motivated by profit. So, I mean, right off the bat, you have the motivation, which is wrong-headed. I mean, for guardianship, it's supposed to be protecting people, and yet there's a lot of money, a lot of motivation to do exactly the opposite.
And there's a lot of money sloshing around. We're well aware of cases of social workers in hospitals being paid referral fees for guardians.
Right.
We're well aware of attorneys who have individuals who work in hospitals on the lookout for cases. And the shame of this is that when you think of the word guardian, you're thinking warm and fuzzy, strong and honest. That's what comes to mind. And unfortunately, this, what should be a higher calling, it really should. I mean, it should be a calling for people with great virtue and honesty, who are willing to work for less than a fortune for the betterment of society and the welfare of others. That sounds really good. And I'm sure there are some like that. I have yet to meet them, but I'm sure there are.
Right.
So here you are. All of a sudden, you don't have any rights, and that includes the right to decide where you live, the right to decide to travel, to marry, to enter into contracts, or to hire a lawyer. So now that you can't hire your own lawyer, well, the court will give you one of your own. They'll give you a court-appointed lawyer. And these people would appear not to be the descendants of Clarence Darrow, and typically are just another part of the hangers-on in court who typically don't have very good practices of their own and rely on referrals from the court. So that's a biased system in and of itself. In fact, the entire system is filled with self-interest and conflicts of interest.
Right.
So this elderly person winds up being represented by a court-appointed lawyer they've never heard of, they don't know anything about them, and how on earth are they going to defend them? Against the new players in town, the Guardian, and the instant a for-profit Guardian is put into place, the very first thing they do is lawyer up.
Right.
And I don't mean the second or third thing, I mean the first thing.
Right.
And so in any given county, you wind up with a small number of extremely powerful, extremely moneyed guardians and lawyers who become the experts in guardianship in their little fiefdom. These are typically the people who head the re-election campaigns of the judges. These are people who go to the same country club, drive the same car, play in the same tennis, swim in the same pool. These are friends and business acquaintances, and those relationships tend to coalesce into appointments for guardians and lawyers.
Right. Yeah, so this is, it sounds like a thoroughly corrupt system to me. I mean, it's classic, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and I think this subject is probably a segue into the legal profession in general in many respects, because there's something about justice and profit that oftentimes don't go together. But in any case, the reason I'm jumping in right now, we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in just a few minutes, and we'll continue with this.
Yes, sir.
When tornadoes raked the South, it was ham radio that was on the air, saving lives. As communities lay in ruins, it was the hams who let their families know their loved ones were safe. When the power and cell phones went out, the hams were there, helping rescuers get the message through. Wherever catastrophes strike, amateur radio is ready. Amateur radio works when other communications don't. Contact the ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio, on the web at emergencyradio.org. That's emergencyradio.org.
In Ethical Empowerment, Virtue Beyond the Paradigms, Arthur D. Schwartz presents an ethical theory that is a framework for evaluating moral conundrums that go beyond legalistic rulemaking, dogmatism, and preconditioned thinking. The book is as much an ethical framework for unconventional ideas as it is for staying with convention. Ethical Empowerment is a manifesto of non-doctrinaire perspective. Ultimately, the hypnotic thinking of ideology and dogmatism can only be overcome by returning to the true source and essence of morality, which is nothing less than universal love. Discover how the philosophically liberating approach of the ethical empowerment can be applied to the range of ethical, social, and political controversy. Read about a plan to eliminate all political parties. Entertain the possibility of an overhaul of the patent system and its replacement with a system that rewards inventors while eliminating monopolistic control of patents and technological suppression. Many other transformative ideas are discussed in the book, including issues related to the monetary system, real estate, scientific paradigms, and a rational approach to conspiracy theory. While ethical empowerment will challenge your mind to consider new perspectives, the ethical challenge is always to keep the diversity, depth, and breadth of perspective within the boundaries of love. Ethical Empowerment is available at Amazon.com and most online booksellers in both print and e-book editions. You are listening to Philosophic Perspectives on the ArtistFirst Radio Network. Let's get back to your host. It's Arthur D. Schwartz.
Thank you very much, Scott. So we're back with Dr. Sugar talking about this very important matter concerning guardianship, professional for-profit guardians. Of course, it involves much more than the guardians, the whole system of attorneys, judges, and the whole shebang there, and their systems, everyone involved. And the thing here is that we have a corrupt system, for-profit, that has completely, inverted the raison d'etre, the reason for being for guardianship.
I refer to it as having weaponized the statute.
Absolutely. So Dr. Sugar's going to continue now, and he's going to talk about, describing this more, and eventually getting into some of the ways we can go about reforming the system or revolutionizing the system, I would say.
So let's take the scenario to its next level. The individual gets guardianized, and the guardian begins to claw back all of his assets, every penny he's ever owned, every piece of property, every automobile, every piece of jewelry. They're supposed to be keeping strict inventories. Those inventories never match. We've heard stories of large amounts of jewelry disappearing. We've heard stories and actually have documented cases of when the cash, the liquid cash on hand to support the ward in their miserable lifestyle in some warehouse of a nursing home begins to run out. Guardians go to the judge and say, "Oh, judge, we have to sell the house because we don't have enough money to pay for groceries for the ward." And what happens in those situations we refer to as straw man sales. The judge says, well, if you need the money, sell the house, get an estimate. Estimates can be done 5 different ways. On $1 million home, they'll find some estimator or adjuster or whatever they call them to value the house at $300,000. They'll tell the judge. Judge says, okay, sell it for what you can get. And the next thing that happens, the house is sold to an associate of the guardian, a straw man, who within 24 to 48 hours, after having purchased the home for $290,000, will turn around and sell that home for full value of $1 million and never report the profit to the judge.
Unbelievable.
Well, yeah, that's what I said, too. But the same thing happens with cars. In my case, my mother-in-law's car was a 2-year-old Cadillac that she paid $38,000 for. It was worth about $25,000 at the time. They sold it for $100. $100. And they said the guy did us a favor and took it off our hands. $100. And the same thing for every other piece of property. Memorabilia just gets thrown in the garbage. And we know of stories where family members are not asked, but they are demanded to pay for photographs. They pit one family member against another, and so you want this wedding album that's been in the family for 50 years? How much is it worth to you? They go into bidding wars with families. While all of this is going on, which we call legal abuse, there's such a thing as a legal abuse syndrome, and family members are spending their life savings trying to get their parents out of this hellhole, the ward, typically the ward, who is defenseless and vulnerable, is taken out of their surrounding, isolated from family and friends. And when that happens to an elderly person and you move them into a completely unknown facility where they know no one, where they trust no one, where they're terrified, what do you do when you're terrified in the middle of the night and you're all alone? You scream and you cry.
Sure.
Well, that doesn't go over real well in nursing homes and ALFs, so this is my pet peeve, which I've screamed about to the Florida Medical Association, so far to no avail. Some doctor, some colleague of mine, I'm sad to say, without ever seeing the patient, prescribes atypical antipsychotics like Risperdal and Seroquel. As a matter of fact, just yesterday there was an article published that said the physicians in Florida prescribe more antipsychotic and mind-altering drugs than any other physicians in any state in the union. And a lot of that goes on in facilities that are filled with people who are wards of the state because they can. So within 48 hours, this person who maybe forgot where their keys were or had a memory problem or had a stroke or broke their hip or whatever is a drooling vegetable, never to regain their mental faculties, because once they're on these medications, their lives, if you want to call them lives, are a living hell. A living hell, and there's no one to help them. This is when the guardians play another little dirty trick called stay-away orders. It would be very embarrassing for the guardians to have anyone from the family witness what they were actually doing to a parent or guardian.
I would think.
So they go to the judge and tell this story. A visit from the son or daughter, or whoever wants to visit, would be very disturbing to the ward. Therefore, Judge, please give us an order that no one is allowed to see this ward. So we take away everything that maintains a person's dignity. We take away their self-respect. We take away their family. We take away their comforts. And we treat them like what they are. They are wards, and therefore they are chattel. Owned, and I can't say that strongly enough, owned by a guardian as a piece of property. And interestingly enough, there's one guardianship organization in a specific county, I can't mention it, in a specific county in Florida who has seminars on how one guardian can sell his wards to another. Yeah, it's kind of even that one, Florida.
A new form of human bondage.
Well, it's human trafficking. You know, we don't like to use the term, but it is human trafficking. And for a long time, we pushed to include guardianship in the human trafficking laws, which are very strong in Florida. But we just can't make those people in Washington get it. And that brings me to the issue of sooner or later these people die in misery. Sooner or later, everything's gone from the estate. Sooner or later, the people who are fighting are bankrupt and they have to give up. And you move on to the next one. What can be done about this? So, there are organizations around the United States that have tried for some time to develop a strategy to do something about this. Do something about it, meaning make it stop, damn it.
Right.
One such organization is ours. Our organization on the web at www.AAA, P as in Paul, G as in George, .net. We have come together from an organization consisting of just one person, namely myself, and by just strokes of luck, having run in by accident really to others, have come together to become an effective legislative force. There were 6 of us who spent a great deal of time in Tallahassee, Florida this year, developing a lot of friendships that led to the passage of our signature legislation. And we've got a lot more coming. Other groups around the country have not been so successful. For one reason or another, perhaps their social media skills weren't as sharp as ours have become. Maybe their IT skills left something to be desired, or maybe the industry in their state, which is the case in Texas and Colorado, was just too overpoweringly strong for them to even begin dealing with. And remember, people get thrown in jail for protesting against these kind of things. So what can be done? To answer that question, you have to know the existence of something called the probate exception. If you Google the probate exception, you will be more confused about it than before you Googled it. It is a rule, very old, I don't remember since when, that irrationally prevents the federal Department of Justice from interfering in anything to do with guardianship. It is the most bizarre rule you'll ever find. Nobody understands how it happens, and nobody knows how to get rid of it. So appealing to the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Social Security Department, the Veterans Affairs, and every other agency you can think of, and you can be sure we've talked to all of them, is essentially a waste of time. Appealing to the President, well, That's not going to happen, at least not now. So how do you do something about this? How do you stand up and say, this is wrong? How can you be doing this? Especially in a state like Florida, where currently 18% of our population is elderly, soon to be over 20%, especially like states of Texas, Nevada, where all the retirees are going, and especially a big blooming issue in the state of Washington because of all the Silicon Valley money. I hear from new cases 3 or 4 times a day, telephone calls to our 800 number, 3 or 4 times a day, telling me about one horrific case after another. And they just get worse and worse and worse. And of course, I'm on top of all the cases in Florida, which are just awful. So what do you do? Well, the first thing that we are going to do is to continue to press our bet with the legislature, even though we know that unless laws are enforced, they mean nothing. We believe that with more and more media exposures, like being on your program tonight, and all the others that we are working with, particularly if we can get some national exposure, which we're working on very hard, there will come a tipping point where enough people will stand up and say, this could happen to me. And I'm 68 years old, and I'm terrified that this could happen to me or my wife or many of my friends. All it takes is family dysfunction. And once the ball starts rolling, it's like Sisyphus, pushing that rock up, and it keeps pushing you back down. And we have found that there are some wonderful people in the Florida legislature. There really are some wonderful, dedicated legislators who recognize what a horrific crime this is. And that's why in our legislation we have taken the language right out of the criminal side and put it into the guardianship civil side. But in truth, when you get right down to it, there is no way in the state of Florida, where we have what's called a combined Supreme Court, which means that every lawyer in the state of Florida is a member of the Supreme Court.
Really?
Yeah, it's a little unique, and there's an interesting rub to that, and that is you can't belong to 2 houses of government, which theoretically means that no lawyer can be in the legislature. Of course, 99% of the people in the legislature are lawyers. That's for another show. But we have found some compassionate people, but what we have not been able to find is even the slightest hint of recognition from the one person who could change this all in a heartbeat, and that's the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court, who happens to be a fellow named George Labarja, or Jorge Labarja. We have been completely unsuccessful with him, and the one other person who could make a big difference here is the Attorney General of the state of Florida, Ms. Pam Bondi. We have tried to get in to see her in person so many times by email and fax. Impossible. She refuses to even hear about this, which is the same tactic as the Supreme Court does.
Unbelievable.
What we're hopeful of is that someday, somehow, with enough media exposure and enough outrage from the citizenry, and the same thing, I'm sure, is going to happen in Massachusetts.
Yeah, Dr. Sugar, I also, you and I had spoken privately, I think, yesterday, and you talked about you had this legislation passed, but it's this conspiracy, is what I would call it, and because of all the legal profession, the judges, the lawyers, and everybody else, they're all there, look after each other, that it's not being enforced.
Well, not only is it not being, now let's not be too hasty. It's only been a law for a week or so.
Okay.
So that doesn't happen overnight.
All right.
But what I will say is that our experiences collectively with the organizations put together to protect the public from lying lawyers and guardians who are sadistic, those mechanisms are irreparably broken. In the state of Florida, if you want to complain against a lawyer, you lodge what's called a bar complaint. It's the same in every state, really. The percentage of bar complaints that actually result in anything more than a tiny, tiny tap on the wrist in Florida is pathetic. It's less than a fraction of 1%. And unless a lawyer is found red-handed with money that belongs to a client that he's spending at the racetrack, literally, they have no fear of lying until the cows come home. Yeah. The organization that's put in place by statute in the state of Florida to monitor judges, called the Judicial Qualifications Committee, and again, every state has something like this. Every state. That organization has censured. Now, when I say censured, it's public embarrassment, saying, hey, you screwed up.
Right.
They get thousands of requests every year. Now, many of them are from convicts in jail, so you do have to have a little perspective on that.
Right.
But their rate of inflicting even the tiniest little whisper on the wrist of a judge is 0.00001.
Yeah, wow.
It doesn't happen. And so effectively, complaints about judges and complaints about judges and lawyers are a total waste of time.
Unbelievable.
Total waste of time. It's not unbelievable. It's in every state. It's the same. The only state that I know of that's actually taking action in this regard is Nevada, because Nevada had a lot of bad press publicly about two particular guardians, both of whom are in prison now. And the Chief Justice of the state of Nevada said, I've had enough of this, and is reforming that system as we speak. But the results have yet to be seen.
Right.
So I'll hold my judgment until I see what happens.
Right. Oh no, we're going to take another short break. But when we get back, I'm hoping that before we leave tonight, that you can present to the audience another classic case that can stay in the mind, that exemplifies why this is so important.
Sure.
Okay. So we'll be back in just about a couple minutes or so.
This is Arthur D. Schwartz. Beliefs and disbeliefs can be very powerful. Much like philosophy, hypnotism is concerned with belief. Hypnotherapy, a practical application of hypnotism, may largely be described as the practice of removing false beliefs that form mental blocks to success, to happiness, and to well-being. In my hypnotherapy and philosophical counseling practice, I combine my work in philosophy with hypnotism in order to clear mental blockages that can occur on both conscious and subconscious levels. A mental block may be conscious or subconscious and can be expressed, for example, in the form of anxiety, low self-esteem or low motivation, bad habits, tobacco habits, weight gain, low performance, and much more. If you are interested in using hypnosis and the power of the mind to overcome mental blocks and barriers that have emerged in your life, please feel free to give me a call at 617-964-4800 or visit www.integralhypnosis.com. That's INTEGRAL, hypnosis.com.
Thanks for joining us, everyone, for Philosophic Perspectives. All programs are archived. Visit ArtistFirst.com. Back to your host, Arthur D. Schwartz.
Thank you very much, Scott. Well, I'm going to quickly hand the baton off once again to Dr. Sugar. We're kind of racing towards the finish line, and I want to give him an opportunity to, close with some information and some imagery that will really serve us well so we can move forward on this.
Right. And before I forget, let me mention that we are in the post-editing phases of our full-length video, which will be a compilation of stories that will be extremely, extremely moving, very emotional, and we'll have that up on our website and probably on our YouTube channel by the end of August. I wish it were sooner, but just to give you an idea of cases that we see so often. A case that I became aware of just a few weeks ago, where a woman here in Florida was taking care of her mother, the typical story, family dysfunction and guardianship, and she petitioned the court because her mother was a veteran, a decorated veteran, to take care of her mother at her own expense. The court would not allow that, and instead fought her for her VA pension. She won that VA pension after dealing with an enormous amount of bureaucracy and red tape, and eventually got control of the person of her mother. That's a partial guardianship. But the money of the guardianship remains with the guardian who is refusing to give her a dime to support her own mother. And that segues me into the one case that I need to talk about, and that's the case here in Florida of a decorated World War II veteran, a colonel in the Army, who fell in love after his wife died with a wonderful woman. A couple of years later married her. A couple of years later made her the attorney in fact for his estate. And because of family dysfunction, a daughter who hadn't seen her father in years and years and years started this process rolling. A judge in one of the most horrible counties in this state, and I can't say the name because I don't want to get in trouble, decided that the best thing he could do for this individual was to annul their marriage, make him a ward of the state, take away his VA benefits, place him in a nursing home, where it turns out he was being physically and emotionally abused, put on massive doses of antipsychotic medication, while all the time, this poor woman who had to travel nearly 100 miles each way to visit her husband every day because they intentionally put him in a nursing home that was as far away from her as they could find. This poor woman is now, she has appealed to the appeals court here, and her story's been all over the papers in this area. She has now, as a result of an appeal from the appeals court, her marriage has been unannulled, but they have kept every dime that either of them has. And so they are literally starving this man and his wife to death. They're not allowing them any money to buy medications for this man, who's very ill, by the way. And they are literally using Nazi tactics on these two poor individuals. It is a crime against humanity, and the judge thinks it's just a game. Nothing. If that doesn't motivate you, if that doesn't create a picture in your mind of the most heinous crimes that a judge can impose, and as a matter of fact, this is what Claude Pepper, remember Claude Pepper?
Sure.
Is a representative of the state of Florida. I'll mangle the quote, but in essence it says, the worst punishment that a court in the United States can hand down to any citizen is the sentence of guardianship, which is only one step removed from murder. And he was right. He recognized this in the early 1980s and fought for guardianship reform, but none of it happened until this year, and there's a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it seems like, to me, it's mind-boggling that it ever happened in the first place. I mean, how it was allowed to happen, how this behavior, people see it happening, and somehow it just develops. It's evil.
I think it's a decline in society. That's my own personal feeling. I think it's a decline in mores and values, and I think it represents a tremendous decline in the quality of our jurists. The jurists in these courts are elected, not on merit. They're elected by electioneering.
I know, yeah, Florida, yeah, I know.
Trolling for votes.
Right.
So, as you sow, so shall you reap. These judges, I'm sure there are many wonderful judges, and I have to say that. I don't think I've met any yet, but or maybe I have and I just don't know it. But what's happened to our judicial system is reflective of what's happened to our society as a whole. And how we treat, this is how you began the show, how we treat the very young and the very old and the infirm in our society is the most telling sign of how we're doing as a society in our experiment in democracy. And from my buck, we're not doing well.
No.
We're not. And, when you talk about philosophy, when you talk about social justice, when you talk about the rule of law, all of these things are being violated in this microcosm. And the truth of the matter is, it's run by a tiny number of people who can make millions of dollars very in a year or two. A good case can net any lawyer a couple of $1 million, no sweat. And a lot of these guardians and lawyers share hundreds of cases. The research that I'm trying to do now has shocked me in that we know that there are tens of thousands of guardianships in the state of Florida, but unless my research is really wrong, there's only a tiny number of them that are not for profit. And if anybody's got research information on that, I would love to hear.
Oh, there are not-for-profit?
There are. There are several thousand that I've identified. But if you think that there are 75 to 150,000 wards in the state, that tells you that the enormous majority are for-profit, and that just doesn't sound right, especially in a state that's going to have a 20% population of vulnerable elders. Something isn't right in our society. Something isn't right in our country that allows this kind of stuff to happen. And all you need to do is listen to some of the judges in Texas, which is a particularly bad state, who actually think that this is just fine. In fact, there's a law that's just been passed in Texas that allows judges to take away a person's money before anything happens, just on the suspicion that they're incapacitated.
Wow.
And then, no matter what happens, that they take 5% of this and 15% of that and 3% of that before any kind of due process at all. So there's something wrong. I don't know how to fix it just yet.
Yeah, it's, I think there's a lot of systemic problems, obviously, like in a lot of industries. So, of course, that's obvious. The nuts and bolts, and the relationships between everyone involved has to probably be completely revamped. But I must say that this particular, since only very, very, very recently I've become fully aware of it, this seems to be particularly mean-spirited, really. And it's a unbelievably mean-spirited thing going on here.
I call it sadistic. I don't feel any
very
punch.
much so, yeah.
And you wonder about that. You wonder about what kind of family relations do these people have? And
well, that's true. That's a good point.
I can tell you, having researched it, a lot of them don't have good family backgrounds and don't live in good family backgrounds. But that's no excuse. How can you do something like this to a perfectly innocent person who, by the way, the judge almost never sees? If you're working in a slaughterhouse, you need to look at the cows whose heads you're cutting off. You need to see their blood spurt. And that changes you a little bit. It gives you maybe a little bit more compassion for animals who have to die so you can eat.
Oh, yeah, well, I'm very compassionate. Like Gandhi said about we judge a civilization by the way we treat animals.
Yeah, it's also true.
Yeah.
But these judges never have to look these wards in the eye. Never.
Right.
And like I said, I'm an optimistic person. I hope that in my lifetime I will live to see some positive change and some more regulation and policing of these people who have such enormous powers.
Right.
And I hope I'm right.
No, I hope you are too. I thought it occurred to me, though, just while we were talking about the mean spirit.
Careful about thoughts.
Yeah, unfortunately, my head's filled with them. But the thing here is that once in a while I meet somebody and they just sort of, when it comes to elderly, sort of like did an attitude where they're going to die. And so, why spend the money on health care, and why this is discounting? And I'm just wondering if that kind of attitude that people have, that many people perhaps have, gets infused in a situation such as we've been talking about today, that allows this criminality, this unbelievable lack of respect, lack of dignity, lack of morality on any way you can describe it, other than the fact that it justifies you can do anything you want so that you can get rich. And if it means, putting, this particularly elderly person away, it doesn't really matter, because after all, she's old.
Right. Well, there are a series of attitudes that inform that perspective, and one of them is of the family members thinking, well, hell, this is going to be my money anyhow. I'm going to go for it now. I can't wait. From the perspective, however, of the statutes and the wishes of the legislature of the state of Florida, their words speak loud. They say we need to maintain elders in the best positions possible and make their lives as meaningful as, they write all this stuff in the Department of Elder Affairs annual report, so that isn't their official position. But think of this. The process of guardianship takes an individual with complete civil rights and strips them of them without due process. It creates a human being who's living and breathing, who has no rights. It creates a piece of human property.
That's right.
Once you can live with that, once you're comfortable with saying this living, breathing person who has lived a long life and contributed to society and has memories and has loved ones usually and has reason to live still and who wants to live, will decide if and when you live or die, and will decide how you live and die, and will decide what happens to your work of a lifetime. If you can get comfortable with that notion that this is no longer a human being, but just a piece of meat, well, then you can get comfortable with stealing their money. You can get comfortable with shutting them up with controller drugs like Risperdal and Seroquel and Valium and all of those others. You can get comfortable giving their stuff to your pals. And you can get comfortable throwing away wedding albums that are so treasured. You can get comfortable doing straw man deals. In fact, I refer back to Nazi Germany.
Yep.
The reason the Nazis got away with what they got away with is the big lie of dehumanizing other people.
Right.
It's just that simple. It's the same thing that the Palestinians are doing now in Israel. The Jews are rats and descendants of pigs. Now, I'm Jewish, so I have no problem saying all of this. When you dehumanize an individual or a group of individuals, there is little or no reason to have remorse about hurting them or killing them.
Absolutely. That's we're going to have to come to a close now, Doctor. But you're stating a very all too well-known reality of the human condition, and that's something we all have to strive to overcome.
Yes.
I think.
So let me repeat. The website is www.AAAPG.net. We're on Facebook at Americans Against Abusive Guardianship. And we're on Twitter. I don't know exactly what that means, but I know we're there.
Well, I would like to thank very much Dr. Sam Sugar for joining the program. This is such a very important topic. I hope perhaps another time you can come on and keep us abreast and do other shows in the future.
I hope so, and I hope I can report progress.
I do as well. So this does conclude tonight's broadcast. For links to my book, Ethical Empowerment, my philosophical counseling and hypnotherapy practice and the Social Philosophizers Club, please visit arthurdschwartz.com. And this is Arthur D. Schwartz reminding you to live well and think deeply. Until next time, good night, everybody.